Okay, let's dive into this. Have you ever found yourself daydreaming about a stroke of just impossible luck? Well, today we're looking at a story that honestly sounds like pure Hollywood fiction. But as we'll see in this explainer, it is 100% real. It's a fascinating psychological breakdown of a guy who stumbled upon what's basically a modern-day magic lamp. But, the genie didn't exactly play by the rules. We're going to unpack the timeline, the numbers, and most importantly, the human mind right at the center of it all. Seriously, ask yourself, what would you do if an ATM just gave you endless cash? I mean, it's the ultimate universal fantasy, right? Finding a magical source of free, unlimited money? Most of us would probably say, oh, I'd pay off my debt, or maybe buy a house, or just help out our families. But what actually happens when that fantasy suddenly becomes reality in the dead of night? Let's kind of ground ourselves for a second before things get absolutely wild. Because understanding this initial temptation is literally the key to understanding everything that follows. Section 1, the Midnight ATM Glitch. So let me introduce you to Dan Saunders. Back in 2011, he was just a struggling bartender, trying to make a living in a small Australian town. He wasn't some criminal mastermind or master hacker, just a regular guy hitting the ATM on a normal night out. But look at how this sequence of events actually unfolded. At 1 a.m., Dan tries to transfer money from his empty credit account to his checking account. The machine flashes, transaction canceled. But then, the cash physically dispenses anyway. No way, right? So by 2 a.m., he's testing it. He repeats the process again and again. The money comes out, but his actual real-world bank balance never drops. And by 3 a.m., the reality sets in. He had discovered a massive vulnerability. Now, what's really interesting about this is how the glitch worked. The bank's system was running in offline maintenance mode during these early morning hours. Essentially, the system had completely turned its brain off, leaving its digital vault wide open for the taking. 1.6 million Australian dollars. To put that into perspective, that's roughly equivalent to a cool 1 million US dollars. And Dan didn't just slowly siphon this over a lifetime. No, he extracted this massive fortune in just 4.5 months. The sheer volume and speed of this cash flow completely transformed Dan's life, literally overnight. And as that money poured in, the pace of his life just accelerated into absolute overdrive. Which brings us to Section 2, a millionaire's lavish life. Once Dan realized the money wasn't stopping, the struggling bartender completely vanished and was replaced by a high-rolling millionaire. The adrenaline completely took over. This wasn't just about, buying a nicer car or making rent. This was a manic, adrenaline-fueled spending spree that completely defies belief. We're talking chartering private jet trips with his friends, booking the absolute most luxurious hotel suites available, and dining out at the highest-end restaurants. But where it gets truly fascinating from a psychological standpoint is his random acts of philanthropy. Because Dan wasn't just hoarding luxury for himself, he actually started paying off his friends' university tuition fees. He literally booked luxury hotel rooms just to get homeless people off the streets. It was this chaotic, fast-paced mix of extreme personal indulgence and Robin Hood-style charity. But out of all his wild spending, perhaps the most absurd detail of the entire story is this. Dan actually rented out an entire high-end restaurant to host a free, lavish dinner, specifically for the employees of the exact same bank he was exploiting. I mean, you can't make this up. He was feeding the bank's own staff using the money they didn't even know he was taking from them. The absolute irony of this is just staggering. It really highlights the surreal, almost dreamlike state Dan was operating in during those frenetic 4.5 months. Moving on to Section 3, the heavy psychological toll. But every massive high has a crash. The fantasy was about to become a very dark nightmare, because the human brain simply isn't built to sustain constant deception without consequence. And this brilliantly illustrates the divide. On the outside, Dan's life was private jets, extreme wealth, and endless fine dining. It looked picture perfect. But internally, he was battling crippling insomnia, severe paranoia, and intense, crushing guilt. He couldn't find any real happiness knowing the illusion could shatter at any second. And what is absolutely mind-blowing when reading the source material is that the bank didn't actually discover the missing money for months. But Dan's conscience? His conscience broke long before the bank's accounting department ever even caught on. That takes us to Section 4, Confession and Consequences. Dan finally reached a breaking point. Realizing this quote-unquote easy money wasn't freeing him at all, but rather destroying him from the inside out, he desperately needed an exit strategy. The guilt and the paranoia just became way too heavy a burden to carry. So he actually walked right into the authorities to confess his crimes, laying it all out on the table. But here is a truly surprising detail from our source text. The authorities didn't act quickly. They didn't immediately slap handcuffs on him. This incredibly slow bureaucratic response left Dan in an agonizing limbo. He had confessed, but he was still free, completely trapped in the very nightmare he was desperately trying to end. He needed someone to stop him. Driven to absolute desperation by that slow police response, Dan's mindset became, stop me before I lose everything. So he took a drastic, highly public measure. He actually went straight to the media. Dan appeared on a national television program to confess his crimes to the entire world. He essentially forced the hands of the authorities by making his secret completely unavoidable. And the hammer did finally fall in 2015, when Dan was sentenced to 1 year in prison. Following his release in 2016, he was ordered to serve an additional 18 months of community service. And the present day? Well, Dan Saunders returned to his life as a simple bartender. He's no longer a millionaire, and he's not some urban legend in his own mind anymore. The narrative brings him full circle, right back to exactly where he started. But, as the source text beautifully notes, he returned to that bar with new eyes. Looking back, Dan describes his entire millionaire experience not as a dream come true, but as an escape from reality. The core psychological lesson he took away is that not everything that comes easily is worth keeping. Impartially speaking, the data of his life shows a pretty stark correlation. The sudden, completely unearned financial windfall didn't actually yield joy. It directly correlated with fear, paranoia, and a total loss of inner peace. The money was incredibly easy to get, for sure, but the cost to his mental health was unimaginably high. Which brings us to a final, absolutely crucial question. Can true peace ever be bought? We started this explainer by exploring the universal fantasy of unlimited wealth, but as Dan's incredible journey from bartender to millionaire to prisoner and back to bartender shows us, financial freedom doesn't automatically equate to mental freedom. So is the ultimate fantasy really worth the potential cost of your own mind? Something to think about. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll catch you next time.